to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock from MCG Quantity Surveyors. Now, today we're talking to a Brisbane-based buyer's agent all about onboarding his investor clients. How do they get clear on the strategy that is going to help them achieve their outcomes? And what happens when potentially that investor is trying to derail the plan by suggesting different properties? It's an awesome interview that speaks to strategy and how you can use due diligence to maximize the potential growth of those assets. We're talking to Shane Hiscock, who is the founder of Locate Buyers Agency in Brisbane. And as I mentioned, this is all about getting clear on your strategy and making the plan first and the property second, and how we can change those statistics to make sure that we aren't one of the ones that only ends up with one property, or not making a purchase that underperforms and doesn't achieve the aims of why we set out to invest in property in the first place. It's an awesome interview with Shane, which I'm sure you'll get something out of. Here's Shane. Shane Hiscock, thanks for joining me on Geared for Growth.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you having me on the show.
Well, the idea goes all the way back to 2023, but we're here now anyway. Now, the topic for today is really all about sort of building that culture and that relationship with the client, and also kind of the onboarding process as well. So let's say a property investor comes to you. I assume it's more sophisticated than you just kind of saying, oh yeah, what's your budget? Well, that looks like a good property. Give us a little bit of a lowdown about how you undertake that process.
Yeah, so when we first meet, we have quite a detailed session just regarding what their goals are and where they're headed with the property purchase. Specifically, we're looking to understand, are they capital growth driven or cash flow driven? And we're also obviously looking to understand the budget. Those couple of things there are really going to help us determine the locations that we're looking to buy in. And I guess as well, we are quite vocal in suggesting that we should be aiming for capital growth. I believe that that's really the goal for investing in property, rather than receiving a fairly nominal cash flow each year that doesn't really change your life too much, and potentially may not result in a lot of capital growth. So we're certainly suggesting to go for capital growth, but always find that people have a little bit of a requirement to reach a certain yield rate. So what we do is we understand all that in the initial meeting, and then we go away and we put a strategy together. And so with that strategy in mind, we'll target particular areas and suburbs where we feel we can achieve the goals that they've set, and we bring in a set of criteria that we recommend as well. So those kinds of criteria would be, we're certainly always looking for an average annual 10-year growth rate of 7+%. Because we know the rule of 72 says that, if it's over 7%, then it's going to double in a 10-year period. So we're targeting suburbs certainly with that criteria, and other things such as the owner-occupier ratio.
Yep.
We look for at least 70% owner-occupier. And the reason for that is that we know owner-occupiers tend to look after their homes, and they tend to upgrade them and do them up and renovate. And those activities tend to, help bring suburb values up as well. So they're some of the key criteria that we work with. And then we kind of have our set target areas, so to speak, and we really get stuck into the search then.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the owner-occupier stuff. It's actually borne out in our data. For the investors that occupy and then rent out, they're actually spending less on average, 50% less on average than the people that just rent it out straight away. So yeah, if they spend some time in it, they're going to spend double the money that the people just turn it into a rental. And of course that impacts the streetscape and the feel, and, prices as well. I'm interested in your thoughts on your sort of responsibilities to kind of hold the client to account. What I mean by that is that a buyer's agent could be an order taker, right? Like you could say, someone could come to you and say, I want to buy this. And you can go, all right, well, I'm going to help you negotiate and do your due diligence. But I know that you're an analytical person that wants the best result for your client. And sometimes you'll have to say, look, Mr. and Mrs. Client, you came and you said you want this, but like you're pushing me in another direction. How do you play that game? And do you think that most buyers agents will have the tough conversation, or are some order takers?
I think some will just roll with it just to kind of get the property purchased and roll to the next one. However, we have a strong set of values in the business that we hire based on as well. And the first value that we stick to is do the right thing. So for me, that means if we feel like it's not a great investment and it's not matching up with what we spoke about in our initial meetings and what the goals were, then we'll call that out for sure. A really good example is I bought for a lady a couple of years ago where we had that initial meeting. She really just focused and wanted capital growth, but then started, and what we did is we mapped out a few areas, and I explained in that call and in the subsequent strategy meeting that the best capital growth for the sort of budget that she had is ideally achieved in around within, say, the 10-kilometre ring or thereabouts. And the reason for that is that most of those suburbs, not all, but just as a general comment, most of those suburbs were subdivided around just after the war era. Right. So they're what we call a post-war home. So they're properties that can be removed. And the closer you come in, the more character homes you find, right? And they can't be removed, and there's a bit of maintenance. But we suggest the post-war type of property because people do come in, knock those over, and as you said, make the street look more beautiful, and it drags values up. So we'd agreed on that. But what started to happen during the search was she was sending me beautiful properties, pretty houses, right? And sometimes the investment's not the pretty house. And so I remember waking up to 33 messages from midnight to 3 a.m. with all different properties in our WhatsApp group that she's saying, I really like all of these, all around Brisbane, which were great, had us running everywhere. But I had to put a pause on it and just say, look, all of the properties that you're sending are just that next level out. So they were subdivided, a little later in time, more around the 70s, 80s. And what those suburbs comprise of are the newer homes, typically brick. They are on good sized blocks of land often. However, they're not at the stage where people are knocking them down yet and rebuilding. So they're really a little bit away from achieving a little bit of accelerated growth. They're just going to ride the market. Whereas coming into the post-war area, you can actually achieve a bit of acceleration by those people, doing up houses, etc. So we had to have the hard conversation. I said, look, love what you're sending me. They're all pretty. They're very nice, but this is what we discussed. This is where we're going to get the most growth. Your call, because at the end of the day, it's my job to fulfill on someone's requirements. But as I said, with our values, it's my job as well to say when I feel like we're going in the wrong direction. So I said, it's your call. However, I strongly suggest that we stick to these areas for the reasons we've discussed before. And I re-explained the situation with those newer suburbs. And she did pivot and say, look, yep, you're the expert. I'll go with your recommendation. And we secured a post-war house on 600 square meters. And I'm always looking for a bit of an X factor when I'm buying. And with that particular house across the road, a builder that I know here in Brisbane had purchased a site, and he builds quite high-end homes. And so what I've noticed, because I've watched him for many years, is that when he goes into a street, he'll tend to build this really nice house, and then all of a sudden, pick up a few extra blocks in there and build 3 or 4 of them. And what it does is that it really sets a bar a little bit higher, and other people who might want to build for themselves will come in and say, look, we can actually build that. I can probably pay a bit more for that site now, and you get an acceleration in the value of the site. So yeah, that's a bit of an extended version of answer to the question, but yeah.
No, I love the case studies, and I love the fact that you've, certainly at the end of the day, we all have to make money. We all have to execute on the request or the order or what have you. But there's a point in time where you kind of say, well, this doesn't fit my ethos or the reason why I started the business. So I'm compelled to say blah, 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 because that's part of the reason why people, know, like, and trust you anyway, because they know that you're going to do that. So good on you for that.
Right.
I want to ask you the question about looking at, some of the metrics that you talked about, 70% owner occupied. We talked about that, 7% or more growth over a 10-year period. I've heard people say before that, prior growth is no predictor of future growth. Do you think that is just one of those stories that gets thrown around, or in your experience, on the ground in Brisbane, it is a fairly sort of set trajectory of something that is valuable? It'll continue to keep pushing above other areas or other dwelling types?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a few years back I went into about 10 suburbs. In terms of, when I say went into, I picked a few different streets in 10 different suburbs, and I traced back history, and I went back and predicted, and saw what the growth rates were. And obviously since then I've watched where those properties have gone. And if you're staying reasonably close into the city, so you're not near any new large subdivision potentials, then it is quite predictable that you will get growth. Now, growth, it never is linear. You'll notice, right? It's always, it goes pretty strong for a couple of years, and then it might sort of flatline for a bit, and then it'll go strong. It'll be strong again. And so that's just the key thing that we do run through with people. But if you stick in that 10K ring, then as a general rule, yeah, properties in 10 years' time, you can expect some pretty good growth. So, yeah.
And that sort of triggers the next question. In 10 years' time, right? When I look at, say, social media around property investing, I feel like the 10 years' time, the 20 years' time, the patient investing, that kind of seems to have been blown away by the hot spotting and the data and the boom locations. No, not mining towns. I think people have become much more sophisticated. That I'm going to buy a place for 80 grand that's renting $1,000 a week, and then maybe vacant for 10 years. But what are clients like when they're coming to you now? There's so much more data. There's so much more media. There's so much more education. Do people have that patience in the long-term mindset, and do they have the trust in the professionals, or do they feel like they've got all the answers themselves?
Oh, there's a real mix. And we do have a lot of people that come to us that are, very data heavy, and want to invest in these kind of up and coming kind of areas. I do feel that there's a little bit of risk in that. And I guess I do tend to stick in towards the major cities, just because there's the history, right? The history's there. Rather than trying to use a whole bunch of data to predict what's going to happen, most of our clients are wanting safe and steady returns rather
Yep.
than hotspot style of property. So if they are looking for more of that, hotspot type of area, and the data heavy, what's coming, infrastructure, like all of the real nuts and bolts of all that, I find that sometimes that you can get lost in the weeds of all that data, and it kind of can overshadow how an area may have really been performing, in the past 10, 20 years or so. So for us, if it's clear that a person's after something maybe more regional or a bit more hotspot, we're happy to just say that's not our forte. We don't, we're not in those areas, and we're not on the ground. I'm a firm believer that being on the ground and understanding intimately the different streets and the different areas is also quite critical in investing. And I think a lot of the data-driven kind of information then results in people just grabbing any property in that suburb, because they feel like all the data says that suburb's going to grow. And it may well, but you might just be able to do a little bit better by being a little selective and understanding the intricacies of the suburbs, for example.
Yeah, and I suppose if people listening think about their own suburb, they'll know, okay, well, that one gets, a bit of a a bad breeze, or it has a bit of housing commission, or there's so many cars that get, parked on the street in that area, it's a nightmare. And I guess that's true for everywhere. And without being, having the boots on the ground in that area, you miss out on that. And if you are just going for a house in a suburb, the difference between streets, you could have multiple percents per year difference street to street, right?
Easily. And yeah, we always say there's the A, B, and C, D street, the A streets, the
Yeah.
B streets, the C, and the D. And so I think it is important to know what those are, because you could just kind of eat into your first 5 years growth by paying, $50,000 or more for a property, just because you're comparing it to something that sold in a better street, that you weren't aware that that street actually just attracts a little bit more, prestige or value for whatever reason. So
Yep.
it's pretty easy to kind of get that mixed up. I remember doing some research many years ago when I was building a splitter block over in that was in Mount Gravatt East, and I was comparing the site to some other sales in the area. And it wasn't until I drove there and went, oh, this site that I was looking at is on the ridge line. It's high up, and it's quite different to 2 streets away, and the values are very, very, they're vastly different. So it's important to know that, I think.
So when an investor comes to you, I'm interested in the idea of of being a good client. Now, it comes a bit counterintuitive, right? Because someone's going to pay for your service, so they kind of feel like, well, I have all the power. You have to do, what I've asked you to do. But I've been thinking more about being a good client in terms of saying to you, Shane, here is what I want to achieve in the future. Here's what I have done some research on. Here's what is important to me. And I've tried that a few times in my personal life. And when you work with a service provider that is excited to work with you, I can't help but feel like the results are going to be better. So I'm just interested, like, are there good clients that bring the right information, the right attitude that you are excited to work with?
100%, right? And they're the clients that come to you because they see that you are the professional in the space, and they're willing to consider your opinions and your thoughts and be guided by those suggestions. And so, but certainly, there are sometimes, and not always, and we try and vet that through that initial meeting situation. Like if we feel like we're not going to be the right fit for somebody, and that we might clash a little bit because there are certain opinions that they might hold that may not match ours, then we'll call that out early and just suggest maybe that we don't work together. However, most are really good. A lot come with some ideas of where they want to be, and it's about then us refining that for them a little bit. I was mentioning before that earlier before we started the podcast, that we'd bought for a client a wall store apartment, right? He'd come to us wanting to buy a wall store because he'd done some research and he'd looked into everything, and he thought these are really good and we like the look of them, and they're low maintenance, and there's no lawn mowing and no upkeep and that kind of thing. And he actually wanted to buy two. So what we did is we found a few options for him, and then, as I was saying, it's our job then to ensure that he buys the right one. One of the buildings in particular, because we analysed all three and we went back through the sales history of all three buildings. One in particular we noticed didn't have a lot of growth, and on average was around 2 to 3% annual growth rate, which is not overly exciting. And the other thing, in terms of our research then for that building, we found out that a site directly over the road from it, which was on the water, was purchased by a Melbourne developer, and there were concept drawings for 3 towers there. So the views were going to be lost as well. So in that sense, yes, he wanted a wall store, but we just guided him into the right one, where we found one of the other buildings had very little sales turnover, and we had to go back 20 to 30 years just to get some data, but we found that they were doubling in less than 10 years on average through the building. So that's an example where the client had the idea, but then it was our job to guide them into the right thing. We could have just went and bought the other one in the other building. It was actually a lower price. We could just, no problems, let's buy it. However, again, our values and my, I guess ethics will have me go, oh, no, I need to look into this. I need to make sure that this is going to be a good investment. I don't want a phone call in 5 years that says, oh, this is a bad investment and my unit didn't grow. And then so with that particular client, as I said, he wanted to buy 2, but then we suggested and we found a house on a small lot of land in Tenerife, very hard to find, and they've kind of got the best of both worlds, and they were open to hearing our views on why we thought that was a really good option to put into the portfolio versus 2 wall stores, for example. So so that was an example of a great client.
Yeah, awesome. That's a good story, and a good outcome for the client. It sounds like as well.
Yeah, really good.
I'm interested in. There will be, I'm sure, people that come to you that say, Shane, I want to invest in my financial future. I'm looking for an investment property, and I have a budget of X, and I don't know anything else. I wonder if you could kind of parallel that with people that have decided to perhaps do it themselves. Whenever I'm talking to a buyer's agent, I like to say, look, my preference is that people always use buyer's agents because they're worth the money, but there will always be people that decide they can't do it or they can't afford it. How do you go from that big funnel? So we were talking a little bit off air, probably should have hit record a little bit earlier. There's some good material, Shane. But you talked about the people that kind of start with a real basic kind of open funnel, and then you narrow that down to, okay, well, this is the strategy and this is the type of property that's going to meet with that strategy. So would you walk us through whatever isn't sort of your Colonel's secret herbs and spices part of that journey?
Yeah, so with that journey, I always find it's a process of working through with the clients, typically the yield scenario that they're trying to achieve, and then just giving them an overview, like I mentioned to you before, about like how the city's laid out with regards to block sizes and post-war and pre-war homes and that kind of thing. So what we might start with that kind of client, where they've got a reasonably broad scope, and often they might say to us, oh, we don't mind about the yield. But the reality is I find everyone does
Yeah.
have some sort of concern about that. So what we tend to do then is we show a range of options. So we'll show houses that are maybe a little bit closer into the city, where they're a bit of a more premium suburb, but maybe they're on a smaller block of land and the house is in a more basic condition, versus moving out a suburb or two where we could achieve a larger block, maybe a house that's had a little bit of renovation work, so it's achieving a better yield. And then, we'll have I guess, a mix of those, even sometimes finding options where they might have some development potential, right? Sorry, I thought someone at the door. And so, yeah, that whole question reminds me of a guy I helped a while ago where he was agnostic to yield. I sent him 10 properties, and they're all quite different, and he chose the ones that had the best yield. And I went, oh,
Right.
interesting. I thought you weren't too concerned about yield. And he said, I'm not really. And I said, well, I wanted to just see what you said about that. But a couple of these ones that you didn't choose can be subdivided. And he's like, oh, that changes the
Mm.
viewpoint. And so that's actually what we landed on, a house that was, in the middle of being close or far out. It was still on a 600 block, was within 200 meters of a centre zone here in Brisbane, and it had the right frontage, and that means you can subdivide it. So we found the Goldilocks property, so to speak. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. So yeah, it's a matter of just helping guide people through the process. And the best way I feel to do that is actually show them real opportunities, and then work through any questions they might have and discuss the pros and cons. And that's the best way to work through it.
That's an interesting one. I've often found when people say, "Oh, look, I don't know what to pick, A or B," and they say you pick, and then you go, "All right, B," and they're like, "Oh," like, and suddenly it's like, "Oh, I didn't. Yeah, I was hoping you'd pick A." Like it was almost like they didn't know the answer until you picked the wrong one, right?
Correct, right? And that's it's too hard to work that out in a theoretical conversation. It's
Mm,
far better to do that with actual options, I find.
mm.
Otherwise, the theory can just spin around forever and it never results in any kind of outcome except for maybe analysis paralysis. It's
Yeah.
best to go, well, here's this property, this is the price, here's the land size, last sold 7 years ago for this figure, two doors down the road, same size block, similar house, similar bed, bath, just sold for this figure. So we've got a bit of a read now on how that growth potentially could look. And then, we've checked the rental pools and we've had a look, and the rent's around this number. So the yield will look just like this. And so by doing that with a few different options, it really helps people do exactly what you said and form their decisions and find out their own preferences that they might not have known.
Yeah, and it's interesting how, like, say for example, if we're getting some graphic design done, the graphic designer say, "What do you want it to look like?" And I go, "I've got no idea." But if you can
Mm-hmm.
give me three things, I'll pick the best one, right? Because
Right.
sometimes it's really hard to visualize, but if you put things in front of someone, it's like, yeah, well, I want that amount of yield, or actually yield doesn't matter because the growth is more important, or yeah,
Yeah.
like, am I annoyed about maintenance? If I can pick something else that's going to grow by $100,000 more in a year, absolutely not. We'll
That's
pay the
right.
maintenance, right? But I
Yeah.
think, as human beings, we're kind of imperfect creatures. We fear the pain of maintenance, and sometimes that can cloud our judgment. Do you anticipate, or I should say, uncover that a lot, I presume?
Yes, we certainly see that, and we do actually show projections then and put property side by side and run that decision and go and put in some factoring in there for some maintenance. But then that's really helping people make that longer term decision. We might show two properties, and one's I don't know, 500, $1,000 a month to hold on to, and the other one's 1,500, and then we map out the growth and say and then we go, so over 10 years, it costs you 80 grand or whatever it is. However, the property is doubling in that 10-year period. But the other one we showed with the high yield, it's not doubling that period. It's only going up by X%. So when you actually factor in its cost, maybe it's 60,000, but you're actually losing out on around 200-300 grand of equity, and that helps people start to decide as well. And that's I find that's a really valuable piece of work for people to see.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to argue with it when it's there staring at you, right?
Would you rather spend 80 and your $800,000 property is worth 1.6 in 10, and you spend this much over the 10 years, or would you rather spend 60 and your 650K property is worth 800?
Yeah.
It's
Or get
pretty easy.
$100 a week cash flow positive, but it doesn't grow, like, and the cash flow seems at first glance, oh yeah, great. Well, you mean I can buy an investment property and not only do I not have to pay anything, but it pays me?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I've seen that a lot where that's not resulted in any growth either in that 10 years. And it's unfortunate because then people had that expectation. They maybe looked at all that data of all these new things coming, and some of it didn't eventuate. So the property didn't grow, or next door there was hectares of spare land. So, another 300 lots have been developed since you bought it. That tends to scare me off in terms of trying to look into those areas. But, and it's a pity to see when people kind of have that outcome. I had a lady I used to work with that did the same. Oh, it only cost me a cup of coffee a week, and bought a property. And then 2 years later, bought another one because it was so good. It's only costing coffee a week. 10 years later, she called me and said, you were right. If I sold both of these, it'd probably cost me money. So, and that was, if you do that when you're 45, 50 and you're thinking that's your retirement plan, then you're quite stuck then, because you're wanting to retire in a few years. You've bought these couple of properties and they haven't moved.
Yeah, and I suppose if we think about the reason why we're investing, it's pretty bloody serious, right? We are wanting to change our financial future, our trajectory, what our day-to-day life is like in retirement, right? Or, whether we're able to pass money down to our children, or go on that round the world cruise, or take that trip that we've been thinking about forever. It's important to get it right. And I think the data is still pointing to the fact that most people aren't getting it right. Most people only stop at one property, and very few go to sort of 3+, which is really probably that point where you are absolutely changing your financial freedom. So I wonder if in finishing you can give us some insights into that, and your best advice to not being that majority statistic that doesn't push the portfolio to the point where we actually have money in a sense that it's freedom tickets and we can decide how we want to live within reason.
Yeah. So do you mind reframing that again? So
it was a bloody long question, wasn't
it? Was a long question. I feel
so,
it changed a bit at the end, but
no, I'll do it again. I'll do it again.
Sorry.
So when it comes to investing in our financial future, it's a very serious thing, right? Because it can really impact, well, what is our life going to be like? Are we going to be on the age pension? There's plenty of evidence to say that's not a really nice existence. Or are we going to be able to do everything that we want in life? So the majority of people are not hitting that point where they're, 3, 4, 5 properties. What would be your best advice to not be part of that majority of people that stop or at one or two, and actually get towards what they envisage as being a lifestyle that they want?
I think that, and I'm sometimes, you might not need too many really either. So it's more about what capital you've got available to get into the market, and then considering then what your ability to save is to get the deposit for the next one. So that's really a key to then being able to build multiple properties into your portfolio. However, it's also, if that lady that I'd mentioned just previously had actually just bought one property in an area that I'd suggested back the 10 years prior for 700,000 or thereabouts versus two $350,000-$400,000 properties, she would have been far better off. That would have been worth 1.4 million, and she would have been in a better position versus just having two properties in 10 years that were still worth 800 combined, right? So I do think it is a matter of ensuring that you're selecting the right types of properties in the right areas, and then considering then how do you leverage from that, and that you might you might employ a bit of an accelerated strategy. You might find something where you can add a little bit of value to help you get that equity for the next property and start adding to the portfolio. But I think to sort of maybe summarize to answer, I think it just requires a good bit of planning up front that that then you've got the evidence as well of those properties accelerating and growing, so that when you make that decision that you are going to end up with a bit more freedom tickets, as you say, when you get to that retirement age.
And so does that really dictate that it's the plan first and the property second, and the property is subservient to the plan?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, because you've got to have that plan, and then once you have that plan and that goal in play, that can help guide what type of property is going to deliver that for you. It's just the vehicle, right?
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I look forward to a phone call in 5 years saying, gosh, that advice I got from you and Shane has transformed my life. And that's what we're all in this for at the end of the day anyway, aren't we?
Exactly.
Shane, a sincere pleasure. I learned a lot, and certainly got me thinking more about my freedom tickets and my plan. And I hope people got a lot out of that as well. So thanks very much for sharing that goal today.
My pleasure. And, I think Brisbane's a place to be too, by the way. So
Well, there we go.
no one else has an Olympics coming up. So it's a pretty good outlook for the next 9 years or so until the Olympics.
There you go. Well, we know who to call in Brizzy. Thanks, Shane.
Thanks, Mike. Cheers.